Good evening and welcome to a Cepher publishing publication. Tonight we're presenting on 10 Kings, a new understanding of an ancient prophecy. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I hope people are present here. I'm not seeing anybody in the chat. Oh yeah, here we go. There we go. Everybody's appearing now. Good. I'm glad to see everyone's here. Want everybody to welcome everyone. Sorry about the delay. We ran into some traffic issues this evening and other scheduling difficulties, and so we kind of ran behind. But this is in the hands of Yah as well, because the discussion we're going to have tonight is going to be a volatile discussion, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in detail. And so I want to open up with a few preliminary remarks that I normally don't do in these discussions, because most of the time we speak only of scripture. But tonight we're going to be talking about some other things besides scripture. We're going to be talking about, of course, prophecy. And we're going to be talking about how prophecy is being realized in the modern world. We're seeing something quite extraordinary take place in the Western world. Which coming into this month of June is a very interesting phenomenon taking place, which is that whereas we might have a single day to celebrate the life and the work of Martin Luther King, or a single day to celebrate the life and the work of the presidents of the United States, or a single day to celebrate the independence of the United States from the tyranny of the crown in Britain, or a single day, to celebrate some of the religious feasts that many of us respect. Even when you deal with the large feasts of Scripture, for instance, the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Matzah, where you have a 7-day or even 8-day festival, no place do we have a festival that goes on for 30 days, an entire month, being dedicated to a singular proposition. And this singular proposition is a very interesting proposition, because it is a proposition that has now asserted itself as sovereign. And this is something that is very important for us to understand, that what is taking place right now is an idea which has claimed sovereignty over virtually all of the Western world. For instance, many of you have seen on our Telegram channel at the World Assembly of Yahweh, or possibly on my Telegram channel, or even on Radio Free Alaska or Eating Wild Honey and Locust Telegram channel, a posting that took place in Britain, where there were many of these multicolored flags posted in downtown London, and the Union Jack, the traditional flag of the United Kingdom, was being dislocated by these flags. And in fact, during the process of dislocation, you see the Union Jack flag fall from its place, from its hanging place, and it falls to the ground with no one to catch it. And so the Union Jack flag is disgraced, if you will, defiled, having fallen to the ground and being replaced by this multicolored flag. Now, this multicolored flag was also placed at the United Nations, displacing all the flags of the nations in order to displace them with this multicolored flag. And here, as you can see in our opening visual here, this multicolored flag was placed in a superior position to the United States flag on the White House, because this, what you're looking at here, is a picture of the White House. And this was posted several days ago when Joe Biden and his administrative staff elected to declare the sovereignty behind this flag as being superior to the United States of America. Now, I want to try to make a point about this that I think is worthy of consideration. Remember that the national anthem to the United States is the Star Spangled Banner. Now, this is a song that discusses the flag of the United States, which was at that time, many fewer stars. In fact, it was only 13 stars, but 13 white stars on a field of blue, and the red and white stripes of the American flag that also set forth the idea of 13 separate states in a Federalist presentation. Now, this flag was extremely important to the Americans who had fought a Revolutionary War through severe deprivation, by the way. And at the end of that Revolutionary War, secured in the peace between what would become the United States of America and Great Britain via an understanding. Now, part of that understanding had to do with us agreeing to pay back the debts of the war to Britain, which were at that time were $45 million. Yes, King George loaned us the money to wage a revolution against him personally. And I'm not going to get into the deep ties of all that, but America then began and embarked on a platform to try to assert its independence and to create what's called sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is the notion that there is no law superior to the law of that particular state within that state. Now, I can give you an example. In the modern world, we have a situation where the International Criminal Court has attempted to indict Vladimir Putin for war crimes. And by the way, there were war crimes that were committed by other people and not him. In fact, they're still being committed, which is with the trafficking of children and children's organs out of Ukraine. But the International Criminal Court, without any evidence or any proof or any jurisdiction for that matter, elected to indict Vladimir Putin for trafficking in children by bringing Ukrainian children over the border into Russia. And the response from Dmitry Medvedev has been, well, you have no jurisdiction because you have no sovereign authority, nor do you have any treaty agreement between you and Russia. Nor does the ICC have any criminal authority over the United States in order to charge, say, George Bush with war crimes or Dick Cheney with war crimes or any of the others with war crimes. The ICC does not have jurisdiction and cannot do anything about it because they have no sovereign authority. In the Middle Ages, we have a situation where King James rebuked the Catholic Church and said, we will not have the rule of the papacy in Britain because that violates our sovereignty. We are the sole arbiters of the law that under which we will be governed. And so the Anglican Church was formed with the idea that the Pope would have no supremacy and no sovereignty in the United Kingdom. This has always been a difficult problem for the United Kingdom, and it still remains to this day a difficult problem for the United Kingdom. But the issue of sovereignty is then expressed in a flag. It's expressed in a flag. And so for us in the United States, our sovereignty and freedom from Britain was expressed in the Stars and Stripes, or the Star Spangled Banner. Now, let's talk a little bit about this war, because there were some interesting things that led up to this war. One thing that happened was that Britain was not recognizing American citizenship. So even though we claimed American citizenship, Britain said, well, anybody who was a British subject at the time you had the revolution is nonetheless a British subject now, and we can basically kidnap them on the high seas and press them into naval service in the British Navy, forcing them to serve on British ships. And this was going on quite often between the Revolution and the War of 1812. In addition, the British also hired what were called privateers. These were not pirates, but privateers who operated on contract, raiding American shipping and stealing the goods thereof in order to create an economic hardship in the United States and also create further dependency upon the crown for any kind of a working economy. Now, the person in the United States who addressed this was John Jay. John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court. He was a very brilliant man, and he negotiated the Jay Treaty, which forced the British to recognize American citizenship and to stop kidnapping Americans on the high seas. And so until this treaty was negotiated, Britain did not respect American citizenship. Now, American citizenship was also asserted by John Jay in the Constitution in Article 2, paragraph 1, Article 2 Article 1, Section 2, paragraph 5 of the Constitution. That's not right either. It's Article 2, paragraph 5 of the Constitution that required the President of the United States to meet certain qualifications. Those qualifications that the president was supposed to meet included that he be 35 years of age, 14 years resident in the United States, and a natural-born citizen of the United States. Now, most Americans have failing to have taken a civics class or a government class, or having ever read the Constitution under which they're governed, have no idea what natural-born citizen means. There's been a great deal of debate about it, but a natural-born citizen is, simply put, someone who is born to a father who was an American citizen at the time that person was born. So if your father was an American citizen when you were born, irrespective of where you were born, then you are a natural-born citizen. If your father was not an American citizen at the time you were born, you might qualify for citizenship under forms of naturalization, which are passed by Congress. The sole exception to that is a 14th Amendment child, where both parents are resident in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and they give birth to a child. That child is not a natural-born American citizen. That child is a native-born American citizen. One has to distinguish between natural-born, where the father of the child was an American citizen at the time the child was born, and a native-born citizen, where neither parent was an American citizen when the child was born, but the child was born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Any other form of citizenship obtained, for instance, because the mother was an American citizen, or under other trappings, are all forms of naturalization. And if your citizenship is dependent upon you being naturalized by some act of Congress, then you are not a natural-born citizen. Now, a natural-born citizen is proved by one instrument and one instrument alone, which is your birth certificate. So in order for you to get your driver's license, in order for you to get your passport, you have to produce your birth certificate, because it establishes your citizenship according to the information that's on the birth certificate. So if you're one of these people, like the U.S. Passport Office that's asking for a birth certificate, or the Division of Motor Vehicles that's asking for your birth certificate before they're going to issue an ID, well, both those agencies are what you call birther agencies, because they want to see your birth certificate. Therefore, they're birther agencies. And you can ridicule them as being birther agencies when you go in to get your driver's license. When they ask you for your birth certificate, accuse them of being a birther and demanding it. And you can also accuse them of being a racist and a misogynist, if you want, or a homophobe, or whatever you want to call them. But use some names like this so that they understand that they're being birthers by demanding your birth certificate, and that it's absolutely unacceptable for them to do that. Now, with that being said, when we got into the War of 1812, the situation in the United States was not particularly advanced. I mean, obviously, New York and Philadelphia were moving along. Boston was moving along. But Washington, D.C. was not. Washington, D.C. had been picked out by George Washington as a proximity to his homestead that he called Mount Vernon. And this proximity was not particularly good. It was a swamp, essentially. And not many people wanted to live there. So in 1812, there were about 2,300 people living in this swamp that they called the District of Columbia. And in this swamp, there was a White House. This White House was not much of a building, and really the government buildings were not much there either. It was essentially a swamp. Remember that the District of Columbia, Columbia is another name for Libertad, which is another name for Isis or Ishtar. So that the district was named after Ishtar or Isis or Easter, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And that Ishtar was the fertility goddess over the feast of Ishtar or Easter. And that they used this feast as a substitute feast for the worship of the Virgin Mary. And you might recall that Washington, D.C. is located between the Virgin or Virginia and Mary, Maryland. So, nestled in the womb of the Virgin Mary is the District of Ishtar or the District of Columbia that we call Washington. Now, with that being said, the British came up Chesapeake Bay and burned Washington to the ground. Then they pulled back and they were going to make a full frontal assault on what was left of the defensive capability of the United States, which at this time was not housed in a giant military machine, but rather was housed in the militia. The militia is understood in the Constitution, is understood by the founding presidents and the founding fathers, was every man living in the country, well armed, that could be called up quickly to come and defend the nation. And so these British warships came off the shore of Fort McHenry, and they came off the shore really loaded for bear. I mean, these were major, formidable British warships. And they proceeded to attack Fort McHenry. And during this attack, this fellow, Francis Scott Key, was being kept on board one of these ships as a prisoner. And for him, the critical factor, the most important thing for him was that in the following morning, following this intentional, cannon fire, artillery bombardment, mortar bombardment that was going on at Fort McHenry, would the flag still be flying? And the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. And, how many men gave their life to keep that flag flying during that bombardment? We don't know. But the flag was kept flying at Fort McHenry. And when the British troops made a landing on the beachhead there, they landed 5,000 troops, and the militia could only put 2,000 to confront them. And so the militia tried to spare off against these 5,000 British troops, and it didn't fare well for them. But they did delay the British troops from advancing, at least through that day. And the following day, when those same British troops were making an approach on Baltimore, they faced 40,000 militia members. And once they realized they were outnumbered 8-1, the 40,000 pushed the 5,000 British back to their ships. And when they pushed the 5,000 back to their ships, the British retreated, and the War of 1812 was abated. Now, this is the story and the history of the foundation and the securing of the United States of America, predicated upon the Star-Spangled Banner. My good friend John Philip Sousa, who I don't know personally, but I like the guy, wrote a fantastic march called The Stars and Stripes Forever, which is an incredible march, incredible piece of music. And again, the idea is to celebrate this mark of sovereignty, the mark of sovereignty, sovereign from the Union Jack of the British Empire, sovereign from the French flag, sovereign from all other comers, that this flag would signify a sovereign place. Now, under those circumstances, what is the president doing putting this flag in a superior position to the Star-Spangled Banner? What is he doing? Well, it's not just him that did it. The UN asserted this flag over all of its member nation states. Downtown London and Trafalgar Square was decorated with these flags, completely covering the groundwork. Nations all over the Western world have asserted this flag as dominant. Now, when we understand that, it's very important to recognize that this is an expression of political sovereignty. Okay? This is not an expression of, gee, we're having fun now, or gee, we're inclusive, or gee, see how friendly we are. This is a statement of sovereignty and is an obvious declaration in your face that your nation has been overthrown. Okay? You need to see this for what it is. Your nation has been overthrown. Your nation state, the kingdom of the United Kingdom, has been overthrown. The United Nations has been overthrown. Okay? All right. All right. Well, let's continue and let's see if we can get off this front page and get onto something else, right? There's got to be something else in this presentation. Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay. We're going to talk about 10 kings. The beast that you saw was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the Cepher of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not, and yet is. Now, this is a very interesting beast that appears here in 17:8. Many people are saying, well, you know, AI is the beast. Prince Charles, or now King Charles, KC3 is now the beast, right? Maybe that's the beast. Well, let's take a look and see if we can get any further information. The beast that was and is not, and yet is. Now, here we see the symbol, the double-headed eagle, that was the marker of the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne. And many of you may have heard me talk about this before. But with Charlemagne, we see several things happening. One is that Charlemagne was appointed by the Pope to reinstate the Western Roman Empire, not the Eastern Roman Empire, because the Eastern Roman Empire was still profiting, was still established, was still going on in 800 AD when this Holy Roman Empire was created, actually in Austria and Germany and so forth, under Charlemagne, an illiterate man who could neither read nor write. Nonetheless, this particular empire would last for 1,000 years. It would last for 1,000 years. And those 1,000 years would take it all the way into the 1800s, displaced only by Napoleon Bonaparte. All right. Now, when that happened, Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, disturbed both the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, and took the time during his tenure to completely replace the legal system throughout the continental Europe. And as he did, it became a Napoleonic Code place. The only thing that was not affected by the Napoleonic Code being put in place in the continent of Europe was the United Kingdom, which retained its common law, and all of those jurisdictions that remained under the auspices of Eastern Orthodoxy, or the Byzantine Empire, and its successor, which was Mother Russia, not the Soviet Union, but rather Russia in its expansive reach over what was otherwise a sparsely populated world. And so the Orthodox nations did not accept the tenets of the Napoleonic Code, but lived under a different legal system. Nor did the United Kingdom accept the Napoleonic Code, but lived under the common law. And the common law had been adopted and accepted in the nascent United States, of being explicitly recognized in the Seventh Amendment to the US Constitution, and the practice at the time of the founding was that the average lawyer who would practice law in the United States would do so by studying Blackstone's commentaries on the English common law. They would study Blackstone to become lawyers, and Daniel's negotiated instruments, and so forth. And these were the common studies. And it was well accepted that the common law, predicated, by the way, in the United States upon the Bible, upon scripture, that this would be the law. So the legal systems in the English-speaking world were different than the continental legal system, which was the Napoleonic Code, which differed from those holdings in Byzantium or Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, with this collapse of Napoleon, and of course the fall from grace with France, what we see is a disturbing pattern during the 1800s with Otto von Bismarck eventually causing the Germanic people to become a unified state. And they became a unified state once again under one of the Habsburgs, part of the families that had been present and ruling during the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne. The Habsburg dynasty dominating in Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Spain, Portugal, and throughout Germany and Austria, Hungary, etc. These were Habsburgs that were controlling these regions. And even the current crown in Britain are relatives to the Coburg Gotha are relative to the Habsburgs. So the Habsburgs were a family line that were present and governing during the Holy Roman Empire, and they re-secured their position following the death of Napoleon in everywhere except France, which was not prepared to accept another monarch such as Louis XVI. All right. Now, it is in that fabric that we see the desire to once again reform the Holy Roman Empire, this empire being the Second Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Second Rome, second to Western Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years from 800 to 1817, and it would be replaced by a third Rome, called the Third Reich. The Third Reich. Now you can see the eagle on the symbolism here, the same eagle, except this is a single-headed eagle instead of the double-headed eagle. But we have this same kind of phoenix, same kind of eagle, same kind of positioning that we had in the Holy Roman Empire in the second inception. This is now the third inception. That's why it's called the Third Reich, because it's the third inception of the Roman Empire, the third inception of Western Rome, and designed to do the same thing that the second inception did, which was designed to do the same thing that the first inception did, which was to capture and to control all of Europe, including the United Kingdom. But the Third Reich had wider goals than just the Second Reich. The Third Reich was a kingdom that had said, Deutschland über alles, Germany over everybody. And the idea was to impose the Third Roman Empire over the whole world. So it's very important to understand here that the name Third Reich makes it obvious that we're talking about a Roman Empire, and that it is the impetus behind the Roman Empire has always come from the papacy. The papacy, the popes, when you talk about the initial popes, these popes, initially the pope was the Caesar who declared himself to be God. Caesar was God. Now, after the collapse of political Rome, the pope took the spiritual side of that office and said, as to matters ecclesiastical, the Pope is in place of God on earth. In the Latin, they call this vicarius filio Dei. Vicarius filio Dei. Okay, There can be no question then that the rise of the Third Reich was done with the permission and the direction of the papacy. There should be no question in your mind that these two Reichs, the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne and the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler, were tied directly to Western Rome and the papacy out of the Vatican. All right. Now, this thing, the Third Reich, was and then was defeated in World War II. And it was defeated in World War II really rather horrifically. The Germans, under their air force called the Luftwaffe, or the Luftwaffe, bombed the United Kingdom, which was the only place in the continent that was resistant to the German ascendancy. And of course, the Byzantine heirs, namely Russia, were also in opposition to German ascendancy. And so Germany had to fight on two fronts. They had to fight against the UK and they had to fight against Russia. And in fighting against the UK, they bombed the UK incessantly for 4 years. They destroyed the Swansea in Wales. They destroyed a major portion of London. And there was a lot of bombing that took place, to the point that when the war was closing out, Winston Churchill took the opportunity to engage in a firebomb campaign against the city of Dresden that was very, very horrific. And this was a pattern that went on for 72 hours of the United States and the United Kingdom dropping bombs over the city of Dresden. And while those bombs were exploding, dropping bombs into the explosion and then dropping bombs into that explosion. And that went on for 72 hours. And it created a fire cloud that rose to 60,000 feet and an absolute inferno that was much more deadly than the nuclear weapons used at Hiroshima or in Nagasaki. It was horrific what happened in Dresden. We also flattened, Frankfurt and Hamburg and Berlin was also flattened. In fact, most of the industrial area belonging to the Third Reich was flattened, absolutely pulverized by the Allies. And, D-Day saw us marching in on the beaches of Normandy in France. And we also beachheaded in the island of Sicily and came up the Italian peninsula, George Patton leading that army. And we were successful against the Germans because the Germans had the vast majority of their army obliterated in the Eastern Front. You might remember Commandant Klink and Stalag 17 with Sergeant Schultz, who saw nothing and heard nothing in Hogan's Heroes. And the great threat to Commandant Klink that came down from General Berghater was that he was going to be sent to the Russian front if he didn't behave himself. And what was the Russian front? Well, the Russian front was three fronts, really. And that was in St. Petersburg, at that time called Leningrad, Kursk, which was called Kursk then and still called Kursk today. And of course, Stalingrad, which is now called Volgograd and had been Volgograd in the past. And in these three areas, the Germans took huge losses, as did the Russians. We're talking millions of troops lost in all three fronts by both parties, by both Russia and Germany. And ultimately, the Germans lost on all three fronts. In St. Petersburg, they lost at Kursk, and they lost at Stalingrad. And when they did, Russian troops advanced across Belarus and Ukraine and advanced against German troops in Poland and advanced against German troops all the way to Berlin. And it was Russian troops who took down the Nazi flag over the Reichstag in Berlin and secured the defeat of Germany. We took part on the Western side, but they secured the defeat on the Eastern side. So the Third Reich was defeated, correct? Well, no, not correct at all. The political machinery of the Third Reich was defeated. But the leadership in the Third Reich, believing that they had the right to rule Europe, quickly regrouped, and this time, rather than rearming and engaging in war, secured the continent by other means. And now the continent is secured under the hands of the Third Reich, its successor, that they called the EU. Now, we don't see it as the Third Rome. Why? Because it is not, and yet it is. The Third Reich is not, and yet it is. And here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains upon which the woman sits. Now, many of you have looked at this passage and have said, well, there's 7 hills in Rome. There's 7 hills in Constantinople. There's 7 hills in Washington, D.C. There's 7 hills in Denver, for heaven's sakes. Therefore, wherever there's 7 mountains or hills, well, I guess it depends on how you define mountain, right? When does a mountain become a mountain? When it rises above the tree line? When is a mountain and not a hill, right? The 7 heads are 7 mountains, but remember that the book of Chazon is metaphorical. For instance, in chapter 1 in the book of Chazon, we see that Mashiach stands among 7 menorah and also has 7 stars in his hand. And what do we see? We see that the 7 stars mean the 7 angels of the 7 called out assemblies, and the 7 menorahs mean the 7 called out assemblies. Okay, that's kind of interesting. All right. Now, with that being said, we can tell when we look at this now that we might not be speaking about figurative mountains, but we might be talking about something quite large, a mountain overlooking a valley, asserting its presence, asserting its authority, asserting its, when you talk about a mountain, at the top of a mountain is a peak, at the top of the peak, right? And this woman is sitting atop these 7 mountains. And what's it tell us? There are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goes into perdition. Wow. Now, Nazi Germany was the German state between 1933 and 1945, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party controlled the country, transforming it into a dictatorship. Now, this is going on in the United States right now. In fact, I guess it was Fox News yesterday labeled Joe Biden as quote unquote wannabe dictator. And so there is a push in the United States right now to take the United States into a dictatorship, and in particular, to take it into a Nazi-like dictatorship, okay? So under Hitler's rule, Germany quickly became a totalitarian state where many aspects of life were controlled by the government. Virtually all aspects of life were controlled by the government. They seized essentially all of the means of production. You might recall that it was the Volkswagen people's car that had came out of the seizure of Mercedes-Benz and Porsche, Audi, and so forth. The Volkswagen would be what would erupt. Okay. Now, the Third Reich meant the Third Realm or the Third Empire, referred to the Nazi claim that Nazi Germany was the successor to the early Holy Roman Empire. You see this? This is according to Wikipedia. The Third Reich means that that Germany believed it was the successor to the Holy Roman Empire. All right. Now let's take a look at the popes that were in place when the Holy Roman Empire was reformed in its third reincarnation. Okay. Well, we had Pius XI, and he was in place when Hitler initially formed the Reich. Then we had Pius XII, who took over when Hitler went to war in 1938-39. Pius XII was in place. And he would rule until 1958, where he was replaced by Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd was the one that was present when John F. Kennedy was elected president. And he died in 1963 and was followed by Pope Paul VI. Now, Pope Paul VI, who reigned until 1978, he was the last pope crowned. Okay. All the popes after that would not be crowned. Then we had Pope John Paul I, who I forget, he was in office for 30 days before he was killed, something like this. Okay. Then we get John Paul II, a non-Italian pope. And then we get Benedict XVI, who supposedly resigned in 2013, who also was a non-Italian pope. He was German. Well, of course he'd be German, because we're going to see during his tenure that the Reich would rise again. The Reich would rise again. And then, of course, we get number 8, who is Francis. Now, there's some interesting things about Francis. The Third Reich began to reorganize first as the European coal and steel community. So here you have Germany and the Third Reich lose the war in 1945. And they have immediately begun to regroup with a new strategy to seize control of Europe under the European coal and steel community in 1951. This is under Pope Pius XII. Then this becomes the European Economic Community, or the EEC, in 1958. And they also formed another community, again, the European Atomic Energy Community, the EAEC, in 1958. Okay? Then that was under Pope John the 23rd, Pope Paul VI, and Pope John Paul I. So by the time we get here before the European Union forms, 5 popes have fallen. Then in the 6th pope, Pope John Paul II, the European Union forms in 1992. So 5 are fallen, 1 is to fall. Okay? Now the Third Reich reemerges then. The Third Reich reemerges as a political military machine in 2014 with the Maidan coup in Ukraine. The 7th Pope, German, sits. He is and yet isn't, because he resigned in 2013, but who's ever heard of a Pope resigning? They're Pope until death. So here he was, the sitting Pope, who had lost his authority because he's replaced by a usurper Pope, the 8th, who's an Italian Argentinian, the son of a Nazi who had escaped persecution in Italy by fleeing to Argentina. This Pope emerges at the same time that the Maidan coup takes place in Ukraine. This is during the first year of Pope Francis's reign that the Maidan takes place. And when the Maidan takes place, the nation of Ukraine is overthrown and its culture is overthrown. And what I mean by that is that the Ukrainian culture at the time of the Maidan was essentially, it was kind of a, how do you put it, a little bit slower culture. And it was widely diverse because the culture included a Polish-speaking people, Hungarian-speaking people, Ukrainian-speaking people, and Russian-speaking people. And you had people who were practicing Western Catholicism, as well as Ukrainian Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy in the same nation. There were diverse political parties, and they held different views. And of course, part of what took place is that in Ukraine, prior to Maidan, there was what was called an Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution brought a couple of people to power. Now, there were some very interesting things that happened during the Orange Revolution. There was a pastor who had come into Ukraine from, I believe it was the Congo. And he was a black man out of Africa named Sunday Adelaja. And Sunday Adelaja had come into Ukraine to study how to engage in a communist overthrow of his own nation. But when he got there, the Soviet Union had failed and had collapsed, and nobody was teaching that protocol anymore. So he ended up in the seminary. Now, when he got out of the seminary, he began to form a church, and it was going nowhere quickly. And finally, he realized he needed to minister to the homeless and the heroin addicts in Kiev. So he did. And as he did, his church began to grow, and then his church became very large. And by the year 2000, Sunday Adelaja was the single largest Pentecostal church in Eastern Europe. And in fact, he had 120 other churches under him. And Sunday Adelaja had a very interesting person who was attending his churches. And this would be a woman who ultimately would take command in Ukraine. And so you had several people there. And the idea of it coming into the Orange Revolution was stated by Yulia Tymoshenko, who said, Ukraine will never stand on its feet until it gets on its knees before Yah. Well, this was a great statement and a great idea because, of course, the Christian faith was springing back very pronounced in Ukraine, as it was in Russia. However, with the 2014 Maidan, which was unprecedented violence and a ruthless coup d'etat thrown against the Ukrainian people and organized by the American CIA and the State Department under the tutelage of Hillary Clinton and absolutely spearheaded by Victoria Nuland, an Israeli citizen holding a high position in the United States State Department. And Victoria Nuland and her husband engaged in very ruthless tactics to install their people in government in Ukraine, including the deployment of snipers who were killing civilians in downtown Kiev during this Maidan Revolution. And so this was very much a very aggressive anarchy that was tossed into the mix. And this same kind of anarchy, by the way, is going on in Sudan right now. And again, it's under the tutelage of Victoria Nuland, who is, took $28 million allocated to the idea of overthrowing the Sudanese government because they're trying to keep the Sudanese from allowing the installation of a Russian Navy base along the Red Sea. And so this is the agitation that's taking place in the Sudan. But who's the leader of this agitation? It's already resulted in the death of 2,000 people. It's Victoria Nuland, the same person who agitated the deaths of all of these civilians in downtown Kiev at Maidan Square with this Maidan uprising. And so after the Maidan uprising in 2014, we see the abandonment of the Christian faith and the move towards radicalization under the tenets and the auspices of the Third Reich, which was going to take the gloves off in Ukraine and emerge conspicuously as the Third Reich, even though it is directly under the control of the EU and the EU's armed forces called NATO. And so we see an interesting joining of the eighth Pope that accompanies this rebirth of the Third Reich, of the Holy Roman Empire, and that this Pope is going to be the one that is going to go into perdition. And the perdition there, the Greek word there is apoleia, which means damnation and destruction. And so this is what is coming now to the thing that was and is not and yet is. Okay. So let's see if we can get into a more difficult subject, which we're about to engage in right now. This is a very difficult subject, and this is, I'm thankful to Yah that he did not allow me to predispose this this particular teaching before I did. Okay, and before I get there, Yahweh's child is asking a question. Wasn't Simon Peter Magus the first pope around 324 AD? Magus went to Rome after Apostle Peter rebuked him. Well, a lot of that, well, let me just throw this out to you, Yahweh's child, and think about this for a minute. Peter was alive at the time of Mashiach. So 324 AD is going to be, roughly 300 years in the future. So Peter could not have, Simon Peter, the disciple, could not have possibly rebuked Simon Magus if Simon Magus was alive 300 years later. The mythology about Simon Magus is a mythology that is born in what's called a Gnostic work. And this Gnostic work talks about Peter and Simon Magus being in Rome together, and Simon Magus flying around. He can fly around like Superman and doing these kinds of stunts and so forth. And no, that's not the case at all. The very first bishop of Rome was named Lucius, also called Linus, but Lucius was the son of Caradoc. And Caradoc was the son of Old King Cole, if you will, and Old King Cole, I believe, was the king in place at the time that Joseph of Arimathea came into Britain. And, this idea of Anna, the sister of Miriam, marrying the king, and then Lucius would be of a direct line of Anna. So Lucius would have been in the direct line of kings to David through his mother, through his grandmother. And Lucius would then become a good friend with Paul, because Paul was an interface with this British family that was in exile from Silesia in what was basically Wales and southwestern Britain. They had lost a battle. Caradoc had lost a battle, and his family was taken hostage in Rome. And it was this family to whom Paul wrote the book of Romans. It's this family that Paul is continually greeting, these people who were living in Rome under Roman names, but were actually from the British Isles. Lucius would become a very good friend of his, and Lucius would begin to work with Paul. And Lucius was very skilled in Greek, Latin, and whatever language was being spoke in the British Isles, and could also converse with Paul with little difficulty. So it was Lucius that wrote the Gospel of Luke. It was Lucius that wrote the book of Acts. It was Lucius that wrote 2 Corinthians, and probably Lucius who wrote the book of Hebrews. And Lucius was appointed the first bishop of Rome by Paul. Peter had nothing to do with it. Paul was the one who appointed the first bishop of Rome. He appointed the first bishop of Sevilla in Spain, the first bishop of Cordova, and anointed the first bishop of London, Aristobulus V, on his travels into Britain. So the papacy, of course, didn't become the papacy until they began to claim that the Pope was more equal than other bishops. Okay? So thank you for that question. Great question. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom. Okay, 10 kings with no kingdom as yet. So a lot of people are saying, well, that's going to be when the Illuminati divide the world into 10 sectors. Or that's going to be 10 kings that are going to be in Europe under the EU. But they receive power as kings. They receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast that was and is not and yet is. They're going to receive power with the beast for 1 hour. These have one mind. In other words, they've got the same thing on their mind, these kings, and they give their power and strength unto the beast. Now, this is the first part of this prophecy. Now, let's take a look at this word, Basilius. Basilius. You can see here when we look at this word, let's do a little bit of highlighting here. We can see. Okay, so 10 kings, right? 10 kings. The word there in the Greek, Basilius. Basilius. Well, Basilius means king. Sure, it does. Means king. Here it is, i.e., a king. But really, what is it? Basilius is a foundation of power. It's a foundation of power. So, and the 10 horns which you saw are 10 powers, or 10 sovereigns, or 10 kings, 10 powers which receive no kingdom. These are kings without a kingdom. How can you have a king with no kingdom? You bet. You're welcome, youngest child. I'm glad I could answer your question. How is it that you can have a king with no kingdom? Well, it's because the king language here is figurative, right? It's figurative. And so what you see here is that they've received no kingdom as yet, but they receive power as kings for 1 hour. They receive power like they were kings, but they aren't. They have kings for a very short period of time. They have the power of kings for a very short period of time with the beast, which is the rising Reich. Now, before we go on to the next slide here, I want to go back and reflect again on the expansion of the Reich. And again, remember that we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire, being spiritually empowered by the Vatican. It's spiritually empowered by the Vatican, always tied to the Vatican, and always trying to recreate the Western Roman Empire that was lost in around 430 AD. The political power that Rome had, they would recapture in the Holy Roman Empire, causing all of Europe, up until the Protestant Revolution beginning in 1532, they caused all of Europe to come under the absolute control of the Roman Church. If for those of you who've been in my common law class, we've been studying the Magna Carta. And we know that during the Magna Carta, there were several things that happened. Number one, there was the concession of King John, which was signed in 1213 AD. And this occurred because King John did not want a fellow named Stephen Langton to be appointed to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Just for the sake of this discussion, so you know, Canterbury was the beachhead of Rome in the United Kingdom. It was established by Augustine in the 590s. He built an abbey there, which was kind of a miniature fortress. And after he succeeded in establishing himself in Canterbury, he had the bishops that were in the western part of the United Kingdom, namely the Welsh bishops, had them all excommunicated and ultimately executed so that he could force Romanism on the British Isles. And that's what he did. And the Roman Church would expand and expand and expand. And the Roman Church would then come back in with William the Conqueror to impose Romanism again on the Anglo-Saxons and their Danish kings, and to push back on the practices of the Chaldees and the true faith that was going on in the British Isles at that time, to impose Rome. And then when they imposed Rome, it would be Edward I that would push all the way out to conquer Scotland. And Edward II was given permission by Rome in the 1330s to go in and Catholicize Ireland. Well, wait a minute. I thought St. Patrick chased all the serpents out and Catholicized Ireland in the 7th century. It's an absolute lie. It never happened. If Ireland was all Catholic, then why did Edward come in to the island? Excuse me, it wasn't Edward, it was Henry II. Why did Henry II come onto the island in order to impose Catholicism at the demands of Rome if everybody was Catholic? How'd that happen? Okay, so when you see this now, so Stephen Langton wants to be the Archbishop. He's an agent who has betrayed the United Kingdom, he's betrayed the British Isles, and he's working for the Pope. And the Pope wants him in place at Canterbury. And King John also a usurper to the British throne. King John said, forget it. I'm not going to have this guy appointed. I got my own guy. So the Pope excommunicated King John and excommunicated all of Britain. So the British Catholics that had been Catholics since the time of Augustine were told you can have no confession and you have no pathway to heaven because your king has caused you to become excommunicated. So the pressure rose up against King John, and King John in 1213 signed a concession to Rome, granting Rome complete control over the throne and over all of the lands of Britain, including any lands that Britain would ever conquer, in perpetuity and forever. Thereafter, Stephen Langton got appointed to the archbishop seat in Canterbury, and it was Stephen Langton who was at the tip of the sword imposing the Magna Carta on King John. Okay? He imposed the Magna Carta on King John. So you can see here that Rome at this point was controlling all of Europe. And it was controlling it under the idea that your king either follows my commands or we deprive all of the ignorant peasantry a pathway to heaven until they kill you and put in a new king who will comply with the demands of Rome. And this was the case until the Protestant Revolution in the 1530s, with Martin Luther's pulling away from Rome in Germany, and with Henry VIII pulling away from Rome in Britain. And this would be followed by a much stronger and more strident Protestant movement. Now, with that being said, once the Third Reich was recreated in Germany in the 1930s, Rome has reached out to recapture the lands that it didn't have before. Now, you can tell Roman authority, if Roman authority exists, you've got several things that are indicators that Roman authority exists. One, you see the Roman cross being asserted over a given territory. When you see the Roman cross, then Roman authority exists over that jurisdiction. You can also check the worship patterns of the people that live there. If the people are worshiping on Sunday, then they're under Roman jurisdiction. And of course, the way to understand whether or not your political sovereignty is subservient to Rome or in obeisance to the Vatican, does your city, your capital city, feature a Roman cupola and obelisk combination signifying the worship of Ishtar and Ishtar and Nimrod, Ishtar and Nimrod, the sun god and the moon god, the fertility gods of Babylon. If you don't have the obelisk and the cupola, well, then you're not under Rome. But if you do have the obelisk and cupola, like London does at the Crown, St. Peter's being the cupola and the obelisk being right there next door to it in the park, like Washington, D.C. does, like the Vatican does, if you have the cupola and the obelisk and they're present in your capital city, then you're under Roman control. Now, the Roman control became much more obvious and much more conspicuous following the assassination of John Kennedy, but it became patently in your face with the presidency of Donald Trump, who appointed a supermajority of Catholics to the bench at the U.S. Supreme Court. This is what he did, and nobody wanted to talk about the fact that Gorsuch and Coney Barrett and the other fellow there, whose name skips my mind right now, those three were all Catholics, and they joined John Roberts and Sam Alito and Sotomayor, and of course Clarence Thomas, four sitting Catholics with three new Catholics. So the bench is dominated by 7 Catholics and 2 Jews in a nation that used to ban Catholicism when this nation was first formed. So the nation has come completely under Jesuit rule and under Catholic rule. And when Biden got elected, he flew to the Vatican and prostrated himself face down on the ground before the Pope. So you can tell that the sovereign that is running all of the West, including Canada, including the United States, including Australia, including New Zealand, This sovereign sits in the Vatican and he gives control. Now, there's been recently a letter published by Klaus Schwab where he is commending the leadership in Europe for following his orders, because the World Economic Forum is essentially the intellectual brainchild that is given the directions for what the Pope has established will be the creation and the rise of the beast that was, that is not, and yet is. Okay. So the long and the short of it is that we see Nazism arising again. Now, we talk about Nazism. What is Nazism? Oh, you Nazi. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means you pick your nose and, in public. Well, no, that's not what it means. Nazism was an expression and a term that was given to the National Socialists of Germany. The National Socialists of Germany. Now, National Socialism is a left-wing political ideology, notwithstanding the communists running your school system that have told you repeatedly that it's right-wing philosophy. Anytime that you have the assertion of the state over individual rights, that is left-wing philosophy. In National Socialism, where Germany seized most of the factories and most of the means of production in the German state, that National Socialism is what it was called. And the short term for it was Nazi. But it was National Socialism under a dictatorship of Adolf Hitler. And you saw Hitler seize control of the schools, and you saw him seize control of the factories and seize control of the social events, and so and the retirement accounts and so on and so forth. And he also seized control of the money. And we have seen now that the World Economic Forum has told all of the Western world, you will own nothing and be happy because we're going to seize it all. We're going to impose 15-minute cities. We're going to cause you to have a digital ID. And unless you have that digital ID, you will not be able to buy or sell. You will not be able to travel. Your social credit score will go right in the tank. You will be unable to obtain credit. You will be unable to rent. You will be unable to buy. You will be unable to travel. You're going to be limited, predicated upon a social credit score that is going to be tied directly to your digital ID, which will, in fact, have an inoculation component attached to it, thanks to recent legislation passed by the World Health Organization, another organization working hand in hand with the World Economic Forum to impose the Third Reich upon you. Now, one of the things that happened in the Third Reich that was anybody with a memory can remember, it was very conspicuous. The Third Reich, really, those guys like to dress up. Right? I'm going to put on my chic black uniform that just, shows off a formality and a formidable power and authority in my black Nazi uniform. And I'm going to be wearing my big, medals over here on this side. And in fully formal events, I'm going to be displaying the symbol of the National Socialist Party, which was a swastika. It was a swastika. Now, the swastika is a very interesting symbol because at its heart is the Roman cross, right? There's a Roman cross in the middle of the swastika. And then you have the four legs showing basically that this Roman cross is spinning. It's in motion. It's in motion. This was the ancient symbol of Ishtar, by the way, out of ancient Babylon. It was the symbol of Ishtar. Now, keep in mind that the Catholic Church does not worship Mashiach. It worships, quote unquote, the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is a modern term of art for the worship of Ishtar. They don't change the name of Easter because that's the worship of Ishtar. They just call her privately the Virgin Mary. But the whole idea of Hail Mary and so on and so forth is to worship the fertility goddess. And this is whom they put in front of all of their churches, the fertility goddess, the one that they claim ascended to heaven, which, by the way, comes from a 3rd century Gnostic work. Okay, so with this being said, you can begin to see that this whole idea of the swastika was an idea giving ascendancy to Rome and to Rome's promotion of Ishtar as the central goddess. Okay. Now, this flag is socially unacceptable because the Jews don't want to see this flag because it reminds them of, Auschwitz and Sobibor, and Dachau, and Flossenburg and other places where people were subjected to unbridled torture, including being, preemptively gassed or sometimes thrown alive into a crematorium. So these kinds of sins and these kinds of offenses were huge, many of which were committed, by the way, by Stepan Bandera and his followers in Ukraine, where they killed many more, 10 times as many Jews in Ukraine as they did in Nazi Germany. Yeah, 10 times as many. Okay. So with all that being said, you can see that National Socialism requires a mass movement, and the mass movement requires a kind of psychosis. Now, there is a great book out there by Eric Hoffer, and it's called The True Believer, and it was written in 1948 as he sought to determine what was the impetus behind the rise of Nazism in a place that used to celebrate the poetry of Goethe and the music of Beethoven or Bach. How did these people become mindless zombies behind a National Socialism Reich that called them to go to war and to become extremely racist and to claim racial supremacy and then to engage in these crimes that were crimes against humanity, which have been articulated as crimes against humanity? What caused these people to become that? Well, he wrote a book about mass movements and how mass movements are generated. Mass movements are generated primarily because of a psychosis, a certain kind of psychosis among the population. Well, in the United States, our government, under the tutelage of Nazis, yeah, that's correct. George H.W. Bush was the son of a Nazi agent who was working in the United States, Prescott Bush, whose Union Bank was secreting funds for the Nazi Party during the 30s, for which he was convicted. He helped fund E.G. Farben's development of Zyklon B, which was the gas used in the gas chambers. He helped fund that through Union Bank while he was its president in the United States. But Scherf was his name, George Scherf Sr. He would get adopted by the Bush family and cover up the name of his son, George Herbert Walker Bush, claiming that he was an American citizen when he was not a natural born citizen. He was a German citizen at birth, but it was covered up by an adoption where his original birth certificate was hidden away. But George Herbert Walker Bush took the name Herbert Walker on his adoption, naming himself after the man who owned Auschwitz, which was Herbert Walker. Herbert Walker owned Auschwitz. And George Bush took the name George Herbert Walker Bush in his honor. And when he declared a New World Order on September 11th, 1991, he was talking about the New World Order we're seeing today, the World Economic Forum. He was mentioning the New World Order. In 1992, the EU would arise immediately after he said, the New World Order is going to be here. We're going to do it right this time. He gave permission for the Reich to reassert itself over the continent of Europe, and they did. And they did. Now, once his son took power, of course, when you talk about the Clintons were intimately involved with the Bushes. And then, of course, George W. Bush, his son, took power. They began to implement Nazi protocol. They created Homeland Security and the TSA and all of these other Gestapos, if you will, to control the American population and to engage in protocols that were reprehensible to the Constitution, including nonstop search and seizure of private things that exist on your cell phone or on your computer, which now we know that they have been absolutely stealing everything from you and amassing it in a giant database. This has now been exposed on the world, and Congress is now looking at it saying, what is all this? Well, guess what? It's been going on for a long time. And so at any rate, the PSYOPs that were being performed by the federal government from that point forward, including the Patriot Act, the invasion of Iraq, this motion of doing all kinds of things that were limiting your liberties and then declaring it an emergency really kind of culminated with the National Socialist event called the pandemic, which was engineered by the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and corporations, most of whom were corporations formerly Nazi corporations. For instance, Pfizer is a successor in interest to E.G. Farben. Bayer Pharmaceutical was a Nazi corporation before it fled to Canada. So most of the pharmaceutical corporations came out of Nazi Germany, and they were engaged in Nazi protocol here. There's another Nazi protocol out there in terms of the control of food. It's called Codex Alimentarius. Codex Alimentarius. The alimentarian part is from Germany. The Alemann from Germany. Codex Alimentarius is a food control program that's also being underway. Now, the food control program hasn't been disclosed to anybody, but I'm disclosing it to you now. It's called Codex Alimentarius, and it's a food control program, again, engineered by Nazis. Okay, so you have a group of international corporations, Nazi in their ideology, Nazi in their leadership, Nazi in their expression, that engineered a pandemic, and the pandemic was imposed upon on the whole world. At the same time, Donald Trump was ensconcing in the U.S. Supreme Court 7 Catholics, all of whom allegiance is fundamentally to the Pope and then secondarily to the United States. So we can begin to see here what's taking place. Now, during this PSYOP period that's going on, you're told that, gee, you don't have any expectation of privacy anymore. That's gone. Gee, you should, when I watch these movies now, when I see these movies that were made over the last 25 years, all about these American, these American covert operators like the Bourne Identity, right? And you see these agents, these special agents, whether they're CIA or whoever they are, they just kill anybody, anywhere they feel like it. They fake suicides, they burn people up, they kill children, they kill families. And the whole premise that you need to understand from the movie is there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about that because they're above the law and they get to kill anybody they want, whenever they want. And you need to have the understanding that there's nothing you can do about that. Right? Okay. So all of this stage is set. Now we have a nonstop drone from really Nazi media that's been going on for 20 years of them feeding propaganda in your face, again, working as PSYOP against you to manipulate your mind to achieve a certain level of psychosis that will allow them to hit you with the ultimate expression of psychosis to take you into a Nazi mindset. Now, the Nazi mindset is going to be a mass movement. And this mass movement is going to be one where we're all on board. We're all on board with this thing. Why aren't you on board? Because we're all on board. And if we're all on board, you need to get on board, and you need to get on board with whatever it is, whatever the thing is that we're doing. Okay? Okay. All right. And that expression is going to have some symbols, just as the Nazi Party didn't have, it had the cross and it had the eagle as its symbol, the Holy Roman Empire in the Third Reich. But its sociological symbol, the symbol of its mass movement was a swastika. Okay. Welcome to the new symbol of National Socialism. Now, I mentioned to you before that there was going to come a day when you were going to be required to Sieg Heil this flag. And you can see that this flag has been hoisted above all the nation states at the UN. It was hoisted at the expense of the Union Jack in the United Kingdom, and it was given supremacy as an ultimate expression of sovereignty over the Star-Spangled Banner hanging from the White House by the executive branch. And that's not the first time that happened. You might recall Barack Obama painting the White House in the 6-colored flag color when he was the president. And I have seen this flag flying above the Canadian flag in Canada, flying above provincial flags in Canada. And we have a very interesting situation in Canada where the leadership there, Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, they're clearly doing the work of the World Economic Forum as its agents. They have no allegiance to Canada and are working agents for the World Economic Forum, as are a lot of other leaders in Europe, including Olaf Scholz in Germany and Emmanuel Macron. And of course, one of the agents participating and in the leadership is, of course, KC3, who is working in conjunction with the Pope under the concession of King John from 1213 to give real effect to this flag. Now, we're going to have to start counting now, okay? Now, some of these names I don't have exactly right, because really this non-binary is really transsexual, okay? And so we see this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here we have 6, quote unquote, sexual orientations, all of which are called suspect classes by the United States Supreme Court, saying that any legislation that is created by any lawmaking body in the United States to regulate the behavior of any of these sexual preferences is, the state is going to have to show a compelling state interest for the law. And if they can't show a compelling state interest, then the law is going to be struck down as unconstitutional. Now, let's continue here and let's look at the rest of this. Okay, so now I put this in here as transitioning, but let's talk about what these colors really mean, okay? And I got to be very careful about what I say here because this is gross, quite frankly. You know, this black arrow here does not necessarily have a racial component to it. I think the black arrow actually stands for child sacrifice. The brown stripe here doesn't stand for brown people. It stands for a coprophagiastic sexual preference. And I don't know any other way to put that. You guys who know me, you know what I'm talking about. The light blue here is male transitioning. Yeah, what kind of male transitioning? Transitioning young boys. It's light blue. It stands for prepubescent boys, just like the light pink stands for prepubescent girls. Okay? This is what this flag stands for. Death worship, a coprophagiastic expression, and then attraction to and the transitioning of prepubescent boys and the transitioning of prepubescent girls. What's the white stand for? Targeted for elimination. Basilius rises. Now, you see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 kings, 10 powers who are without a kingdom, but who are given power for 1 hour with the beast. Well, let's carry on and let's see what this looks like. These 10 kings shall make war with the Lamb. Are they making war with the Lamb? And the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Yahweh Adonai and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said unto me, the waters which you saw, where the whore sits. Okay, now the whore is the Vatican. It is engaged. Why is the Vatican called the whore? Because it doesn't have one husband. You see, the Vatican doesn't have one husband, which is Yah. The Vatican also sleeps with Dagon, the fish god, sleeps with Ishtar, the fertility goddess, sleeps with Mithras, the sun god, sleeps with Nimrod, sleeps with Baal, sleeps with every other form of god you can think of. That's why it is called a whore. Where the whore sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. The waters which you saw where the whore sits are peoples. Does the Vatican sit over many peoples and many multitudes and many nations and many tongues? Yes, it's 2 billion people. And the 10 horns which you saw upon the beast, these shall hate the whore. Now, I'm going to ask you, do these people of this kind of sexual orientation hate the Catholic Church? Yeah. With a purple passion, they hate the Catholic Church, they hate the Bible, and they hate everything else about it. They hate the whore and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For Elohim has put it in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of Elohim shall be fulfilled. And the woman which you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Well, now we know which great city it is that reigns over the kings of the earth, because we know that the beast that was and is not and yet is the Third Reich. The Reich is disguised. You can't see it. It calls itself NATO. It calls itself the EU. It calls itself Roman Catholicism. But it rules over the entire Western world. And every nation in the West is in capitulation to that city. Every Western nation is in capitulation to that city, although they don't know it's in capitulation to that city because they think Klaus Schwab meets somewhere else. They think they're in capitulation to Davos, Switzerland, or maybe Brussels, Belgium, or maybe London, England. They're in capitulation to that, or maybe Washington, D.C. But who in Washington, D.C., who did he lie prostrate in front of? Who is under the concession of King John to obligate all of the crown and its holdings to the Pope? The powers that you saw give their power over to the beast, the Reich, until the whore has been made desolate, made naked, and has her flesh eaten and burns with fire. This status is currently in motion. Now, I can tell you that the people of these professed sexual orientations don't know that they're doing the work of Yah, but they most assuredly are doing the work of Yah. The whore sits over peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues, but it is the powers that will hate the whore, and they shall fulfill the will of Elohim to destroy that city which reigns over the kings of the earth. They will be the ones that fulfill it. So they may not know it. Each one of the identities is doing the will of Elohim in bringing judgment to the great whore. In Proverbs, it reads, "Envy not the oppressor and choose none of his ways. For the froward, which means the perverse, For the perverse is abomination to Yahweh, but his secret is with the Yasharim, the righteous. The curse of Yahweh is in the house of the wicked, but he blesses the habitation of the just. Surely he scorns the scorners, but he gives grace unto the lowly. The wise shall inherit glory, but shame shall be the promotion of fools. A naughty person, a wicked man, walks with a froward or perverse mouth. He winks with his eyes, he speaks with his feet, he teaches with his fingers. Frowardness is in his heart. He devises mischief continually, and he's bored. Therefore, shall his calamity come suddenly. Suddenly shall he be broken without remedy. These 6 things Yahweh hates, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. Pride, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he who sows discord among the brethren. The wicked works a deceitful work, but to him who sows righteousness shall be a sure reward. As righteousness tends to life, so he that pursues evil pursues it to his own death. They that are of a froward or perverse heart are abomination to Yahweh. But such as are upright in their way are his delight. Though hand join in hand, the wicked shall not go unpunished, but the seed of the righteous shall be delivered. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to Yahweh. Though hand join in hand, he shall not go unpunished. By mercy and truth, iniquity is purged, and by the fear of Yahweh, men depart from evil. When a man's ways please Yahweh, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. Whoso rewards evil for good, evil shall not depart from his house. So those of you people who like to reward evil to those who are seeking to reestablish righteousness in our nation, and you can't wait to harm them with evil and wicked plans, evil is never going to depart from your house. Not ever. The beginning of strife is as when one lets out water. Once you leave it out, the water is not going to stop. It's going to flood your house and keep coming at you. Therefore, leave off contention before it be meddled with. He that justifies the wicked and he that condemns the just, even they both are an abomination to Yahweh. Why should you be stricken anymore? You will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot, even unto the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment. Your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, your land, strangers devour it in your presence. in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by strangers, says Yeshayahu, Isaiah chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. Wash yourself. Make yourself clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes and cease to do evil. Learn to do well. Seek judgment. Relieve the oppressed. Judge the fatherless. Plead for the widow. Come now and let us reason together, says Yahweh. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. If you be willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if ye refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured with the sword. For the mouth of Yahweh has spoken it. Yeshayahu 1, 16 through 20. Okay, my friends, this is the end of our discussion. And so with that, I am prepared to take questions that you may have. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to pay attention to the chat during this while we were talking, because I wanted to make myself get through this thing. But if you have questions, you can put them in all caps if you want, and I will take a look and see if I can find anything here. And let me take the questions and we'll see what we can do. Okay. So I wanted to share this with you because it has occurred to me that during this discussion, or during my discussions and my teachings lately, that this had become obvious. It became obvious to me that we were talking about 10 kings. We're talking about 10 powers, and these 10 powers are not what you thought. They're not what I thought. Okay, all right, let's take some questions. So Bird Malware asks, or Bread Malware asks, are the books 2 Hanok and 3 Baruch canon? Well, no, they've never been canonized. That's the quick answer to that question. And Second Hanok, I think Second Hanok is a pretty good book, but it's actually a 7th century Slavic book. And so it's never been canonized. It is read in the Slavic tradition, but not as a canonized work. Now, Second Baruch is not canonized, and Third Baruch is a great and powerful complement to Second Baruch. And so, I think these books are worth reading, but, have they been approved by Roman rule? That's the question when you ask, are they canonized? Have they been approved by Roman rule to be included in the Bible? And the answer is no, they haven't. But that doesn't mean that they aren't good reading. Okay. Sanadria says, remarkable presentation, praise Yah, hallelujah. Yeah, thank you, Sanadria. Yeah, and hallelujah. Thank you. Okay. A Bible prophecy, today's news with W.V. Camille asks, did our country become part of the beast since Project Paperclip? Well, actually, we became part of the beast. We began to lose our sovereignty to Rome very early on with the construction of Washington, D.C., which, as you know, is a satanic edifice. Washington, D.C. is marked, the mall is in the shape of an owl, which is a satanic worship symbol. It includes the Masonic compass and a square, which is a satanic symbol. There is a pentagram with the point pointed down, which is satanic, and the bottom of the point is right on top of the White House. So we have many satanic symbols in the layout of Washington, D.C., and that was right after the War of 1812. So whereas Protestants and Pilgrims came to form this country to be free of Rome, by the time we were done with the revolution in 1789, Rome had already seized a lot of control. And after we left the War of 1812, Rome was pretty much in complete control. And it's been, it's overtaken the nation entirely now. There is nothing remaining of the so-called Protestant nation. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the pastors who were supposed to be dealing with this stuff, whether they're in an Assembly of God church or a Seventh-day Adventist church or a Southern Baptist church or some other Pentecostal church or evangelical church. They have not done the jobs they were supposed to do because they do not have spiritual discernment. I think that's what the real difficulty is. They're without spiritual discernment. Okay. So Sean asks, let's see, find your question here. Is it 40 days since Chucky took the throne? Well, yeah. I'm going to leave that one, Sean. I'm going to leave that question alone, right? Can I explain 322? Visionary Bad asks. I could back when I used to concern myself with it, but I can't anymore. It's a satanic symbol that belongs to Skull and Bones, and Skull and Bones has a certain amount of authority in the satanic kingdom. I don't know what the numbers mean exactly. Okay, the kings are the powers behind each diversity group or the leaders of the collective West. This is a great question, Lisa Jenkins. The kings are the powers behind each diversity group. They're spiritual powers. Now, I was going to show you those spiritual powers when I was researching this, but I got too grossed out and I couldn't show you those spiritual powers of these, when you're talking about incubus or succubus or some of these other demons that are running these particular kinds of ideology. And ultimately, the whole idea that, that you should concern yourself with your sexual identity is a psyop in and among itself. You should concern yourself fundamentally with your spiritual identity. That should be your first concern. And your second concern should be your familial identity, who you are in your family. And then your third, you can talk about where your citizenship is and how you deal with that. But your first concern should be, what is your spiritual identity? Are you saved? Are you not saved? Are you born again or are you not born again? Have you been baptized or are you not baptized? Have you been baptized in the Ruach HaKodesh or not? Are you doing the work of the kingdom or are you just giving it lip service? Are you walking out the way, the truth, and the life, or do you have one foot in the kingdom and one foot in hell? And these are questions that should be at the foremost of your list before you get to the question of who you are in your family. Are you an heir in your family? Are you holding the legacy of your family? Where do you structure between you and your parents and you and your children? And what is your family? How does your family relate as landowners in the community? And how have you succeeded in a unified expression in your family in terms of what your spiritual life is? That needs to be a unified expression if you can get it that way. Very difficult to do in the current environment. But if you can, you want to have a singular spiritual expression among your family members. And then after you have that, then you can talk about your familial status as to what your family stands for in the community. And then finally, then you can talk about what the community is supposed to stand for. But talking about yourself as a sexual creature is an absolute waste of time. It's ridiculous. And it's a total psyop because people get emotional about their sexuality. And so it's an easy feed. Well, let's talk about sex. Well, let's don't talk about sex. Let's talk about something that's intelligent for a few minutes instead of sexuality. Why do I have to accept somebody on the basis of their sexual identity? I'd like to think of you as an intellectual, or I'd like to think of you as a great athlete, or I'd like to think of you as a person who's really made a substantial change in our community. Why do I have to think about your sexual identity? Because you're focused on it. Therefore, I have to be focused on it every waking hour that you're in the room. Well, I don't have to be focused on it. I don't have to think about that. I prefer to think about what is your spiritual identity rather than your sexual identity. And if you want to talk about that, I'll be happy to talk about it. And I'm not going to discriminate against you because you're unsaved. But I'd rather talk about your spiritual identity than your sexual identity. Are you willing to go there? Or are you completely anathema to the teachings of Yah? All right. Okay, let's see. All right. Were any of the books in Shemaim from the Cepher collection found in the Dead Sea Scrolls? No, I don't believe so. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not exhaustive when you're talking about that situation, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are only about 25% interpreted. So we don't know exactly everything that's there, and a lot of stuff is being hidden. But we do know that a lot of the books that are in Shemaim are, and the reason that we published Shemaim is because they fell within our category of publication, which we're dealing with ancient texts that are concerned with the themes of Yah. That's what we're dealing with. We find an ancient text that concerns itself with heaven and the actions of Yah, or the actions of the prophets, or the actions of other characters inside of Scripture. Those are ancient writings that qualify for our publication unless they're Gnostic. And if they're Gnostic, then we don't publish them. But if they're not Gnostic, then we do publish them. And so that's where Shemaim comes from. Okay. And okay, so let's see. Is the 10 toes the G10? I don't think so. I mean, the 10 toes, the G10, I don't think so. I think the 10 toes are something else. I don't have a handle on this entirely, Sanadri, as to where the 10 toes are, but you're talking about mixing iron with clay in these 10 toes. We've got something very interesting happening right now, which is that we're starting to see this idea of marrying digital technology to the flesh. And so people are becoming part cyborg. And this has been talked about since the $6 Million Man in the 70s, that you would become bionic, so to speak. And that all of this is coming now, and it's coming much more rapidly now. And so when we get to that, we're going to be able to see the 10 toes. Okay, let's see. Okay, here's some discussion here. Speaking the Truth is asking, what is the latest on World War III? Well, it's very interesting because today is the 15th, and yesterday was the beginning of the flights of 250 military aircraft over Germany in anticipation and an exercise that many thought may have been an exercise that was going to be used to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now, this may yet happen. This is a 10-day exercise, and at the end of 10 days, they may have worked out all their bugs and decide they are going to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. But the way it stands right now, the Ukrainians have taken all their miracle weapons, like the Leopard tanks and the Bradley fighting machines and so on and so forth, and committed them against Russia. And they've just been slaughtered. It's just been a slaughterhouse. It's just been unbelievable. In 5 days of the counteroffensive launched by Ukraine, they've lost about 1/4 of all of the new weapons that were provided to them, including, I think there's been almost 24 Leopard tanks destroyed. Some have been captured, by the way. There's been over 40 Bradley fighting machines that have been destroyed. There's been all kinds of Polish tanks and Polish howitzers that have been blown up. There's been stuff blown out of the air. I mean, and munitions dumps have been destroyed. And there's been about 7,500 casualties in 5 days for Ukraine. About 7,500 casualties. Now, I remind you that the casualties we experienced in Vietnam over a 10-year period were 55,000 total. And that is dead, 55,000 dead. And, there's probably another 200,000 injured or wounded in that war. But here you're talking about 7,500 dead in 5 days. And so, I mean, I've seen the videos. I mean, the battlefields are littered with Ukrainian dead, and littered with blown up Leopard tanks, blown up Polish tanks, blown up the Challengers. The British will not allow the Challengers into the field because, you can sit and talk about how formidable your tank is, then your tank gets out there and gets blown up. Well, the evidence speaks volumes. And so now the critical thing about World War III and about asking about World War III is that the Russians now have taken a position, and this is what is kind of, nerve-wracking, if you will. The Russians have taken a position that it's absolutely solid proof that the West is responsible for blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was the natural gas feed between Russia and Western Europe that was providing primarily Germany, but all of Western Europe with cheap Russian gas. And that was blown up. And and Cy Hirsch is the one who published an extensive article on it, saying that it was Joe Biden's decision. It came out of the White House and that the State Department initiated it. And that Liz Truss, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, agreed with it. And in fact, a minute and a half after the pipeline blew up, sent a text message to Anthony Blinken said, it's done, it is done. So the West was, in the minds of Russia, and then really in the minds of most of the world that's actually getting true reporting, Nord Stream 2 pipeline was blown up by the United States using a special ops in conjunction with Norway. And so as a consequence, the Russians say we have no moral difficulty at all in blowing up all of the underwater cables that provide communication to the UK. This means fiber optics primarily. And so the fiber optic cables, which took years and years and years to lay down, this would set back the communication probably 60 years. And so you're talking about, should this event happen, it will cause a major market correction and will also cause a further collapse in the dollar. And of course, the key battlefield victory that's taking place right now is that the BRICS are succeeding and the dollar is failing. And it doesn't help that Joe Biden went to South Africa and threatened the president of South Africa that if he didn't adopt this flag that we've been discussing here today, if he didn't adopt that flag as part of the South African ideology, that they were going to impose economic sanctions. This caused the president of Kenya to come forward and call all of Africa to abandon the dollar and to join BRICS. So now there's 161 nations that are abandoning the dollar and moving towards BRICS. Saudi Arabia has completely turned its back on the United States and is garnered into an agreement with Iran. And so all of these things these are the two huge events that the dollar is set up to have an absolute catastrophic collapse, and the SWIFT system is going to collapse, and the Western world is going to be stuck with this. It's going to be stuck with this rainbow flag and nothing else. I mean, it's just, for instance, to give you an example of what the fate of the nation looks like, the United States, by flying this flag. Just look at what happened to Bud Light. Bud Light decided to go woke with their advertising campaign, and now their company is just falling off the cliff. And Anheuser-Busch is looking to sell the Budweiser and Bud Light brand to get completely away from it entirely because it's dead. It died. And when you decide to celebrate these kinds of things, that's all you're going to be left with. Everyone else is going to leave the circus, right? Everyone else is going to leave the circus. And so that's what's going on. The rest of the world is voting with their feet, and they're voting away from the United States because we're considered perverts. It's that simple. And okay, let's see. There's nerve damage. Okay, let's see. The light of my darkness. Yeah, your lost child. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, let's see. So anyway, so I'm just going to wrap this up when we're talking about World War III, that you can see that World War III is going along lines that are non-kinetic. The kinetic war has been absolutely lost. NATO has had its head handed to it. All of its weapons have been failures in Ukraine. The Russians have blown them all up. The very best weapons we could put in there, the Russians have blown them all up. And the Russians have taken very few casualties. There is no real commander in charge of the Ukrainian troops because the battle strategy is absolutely horrid. It's absolutely horrible. And they're sending their troops into the slaughter. And this really needs to come to an end. And the fact that the United States is encouraging this kind of slaughter is just reprehensible. It's enough to make you sick. We should not be doing it. Ukrainian men have a right to live too, and they have a right to live at peace instead of working the campaign to protect Joe Biden's criminality in that country, which is why they're all dying. They're all dying to protect the crimes committed by the Biden crime family in Ukraine. That's why the 350,000 Ukrainian men have died, to protect Biden's criminal acts in Ukraine. Sad, very, very sad, very, very sad. Okay, let's see. Thank you, Joy. I appreciate that. I appreciate your words, Joy Ribbon. Thank you. Okay, where did the definitions for the 10 representative flag come from? Oh, okay. Well, there've been several places that have put those out there. Now, I can tell you this is a good question, Thomas, because I believe they're actually more than that. Some of the things are self-evident, i.e. the modification to the 6 colors, which were initially expressed as LGBTQ plus or something along those lines. So the so-called non-binary expression is, of course, a misnomer. It's ridiculous because if you're non-binary, what's the choice? You can either be binary or non-binary, in which case that's a binary expression, right? It's a binary expression in and of itself. So there's really no such thing as non-binary. And so that yellow is more like the original transgendered aspect to it. when you get to these colors that are the arrows pointing in, these colors are the colors of this radical group demanding greater rights than the rights that were demanded by the sexual orientations initially expressed on that flag. And it is self-evident that when you see a light pink, you're talking about prepubescent girls. When you see a light blue, you're talking about pubescent boys. That's what you're talking about. And so, you can take a look for yourself and do your own research, but you're going to see that this is going to become more and more evident that these are really serious psychological dispositions that amount to some great treachery against the United States. And if you don't believe that there's a push to decriminalize pedophilia, you haven't spent any time in California. Okay. Yeah, so N. Good says, see ex-Jesuit priest Paul Graf von Hoensbroek in his 14 Years Jesuit book, Volume 2. And this is another great source. Thank you, N. Goods, for that tip on that. You're going to discover a lot of things about Jesuits when you read this material. Okay, let's see. Controversial, I guess. Okay, let's see. It's been all the news and we don't want something. Okay, let's see. Against the green. Oh, let me see. Colonel McGregor speaks about the only thing we do if this offensive goes bad. The only step left is to broaden the war. Well, they don't. They can always stop. They can, and Vladimir Putin said, "Stop arming this thing, and it goes away. The war ends, and then we can all go home." Right? Or writings of the 12 fathers of the Shammai book, originally in Hebrew. That is a good question. Now, there are a lot of people who believe that the 12 patriarchs was actually put together by Irenaeus, and their opinion is probably erroneous that it was Irenaeus. I'm being cynical there. The chances are very high that there were writings in Hebrew of the testimony of the 12 patriarchs, and that, but by the time that they get scripted again, it's re-scripted into Greek. Okay, all right. Let's see. Yeah, this was a controversial topic. And like I say, guys, I don't know how long this will survive on YouTube, but I wanted to put this out there. Okay. Debbie Johnson, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. And let's see. Can you comment on Chuck Missler's heptadic structure of the sevens? Yeah, Dan, I can, but that's going to have to wait for another study when we can actually get into the sevenfold doctrine of his whole creation in respect of Revelation in particular, where 7 menorahs are set forth. 7 menorahs, like Dot Chickaman says, trumpet, seals, bowls. In your estimation, where are we right now? Oh, well, right now we're very close to the 7 bowls. We're still working through the 7 seals, but we're very close to the 7 bowls. So I would say that in my opinion, it's just an opinion. It's not a prophecy, but I think we're about 13 to 14 months out from the bowls. Okay. Invoke his great name if you see slimy demons. Amen. Amen. Okay. And then Alicia writes, aliens. Okay. The alien thing that's coming out of Las Vegas, I think, is staged. I'll just tell you that. And I think there's going to be a lot more staging going on by using holograms to create all kinds of images for aliens, because they need some kind of distraction. They need something right now, because everything they're doing right now is going wrong. All of it. And you're going to see now that, and the reason I presented this 10 Kings presentation today is to show you that the next step inside this country, not outside the country, but inside the country, is going to be to push this flag and to require obeisance to this flag with a Zig Heil. And the fail to do so is going to result in you being excluded from society, being marginalized, and being otherwise crippled and being excluded, as they're trying to create a mass movement predicated upon a psychosis based upon 30 years of PSYOP from the Nazis to adopt this flag superior to the Stars and Stripes, superior to your national interest, superior to your theological interest, superior to your familiar interest. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. All right. Hey, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. All right, guys. So with that, we've covered the topics. I want to thank you guys for being here. Now, we're going to be trying to launch here, hopefully next week. I got to see if I can get enough sleep for this. to be launching a Q&A platform on Cepher Publishing Group YouTube channel, which is a different channel than this one. And I'm going to try to put out the videos to lead us to it so that we can have it. It's going to be a short session. It's only going to be probably half an hour, but it's going to be a Q&A session only. And it's just going to be wide open. And you guys can ask any question and then we'll try to answer those. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Dan, you say heptadic structure is saying no errors in the Greek translation of the New Testament, according to Missler. Well, I can tell you, Dan, that is, as I was watching a video earlier today when a scholar came out and said that there are 500,000 discrepancies in the early New Testament manuscripts. 500,000 discrepancies, the least of which are found in Revelation. But in the Greek alone, there's multiple copies. So when you compare it to the Aramaic and you compare it to some of the other earlier texts, 500,000 discrepancies between the texts. So it's very difficult for us to be able to discern what exactly is going on. At some point, we have to say that the text is self-evident, and we go with that. And so that's pretty much where I am now. Okay. All right. Okay, guys. So I want to say blessings to you all. Thank you for joining me on this presentation. Share the video if you're up to it. And, as they used to say, talk amongst yourselves. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay. We will see you on Telegram. And if I don't see you there, I will see you on Shabbat this coming Saturday or here again next Thursday. So hallelujah. May his name be lifted over us and within us in all circumstances. And may we be a blessing to him in our walk. Okay. Thank you, guys. Shalom.